Thanks, Vijay. And listen, I mean, I think it's great to kind of be part of this again. This is, as Arun mentioned, the fifth Taxsutra. For the last 4 years, we have been privileged to be associated with this event as sponsors. So it's kind of like almost coming back home every year. That's what I was telling Yukti. That's what I was telling Vijay. And you know, again, just a big round of applause to you know, Arun, Vijay, and the whole Taxsutra team to kind of bring us together here. So again, I think the topic has been discussed quite a lot in terms of VUCA, world of tax. You know, we're gonna talk through this as well. Yeah, okay. All right, 1 second. Yeah. Ooh. I'll go back. I told you I won't use back, but I guess I have to. And I can't go back. Okay, so you know, again, so we've been kind of talking about the VUCA world since a while, and you know, in some ways, we've really you know, I'll get to the R. I'll keep the suspense on for a little bit longer. But again, in the next 40 minutes, what we're going to cover is again just VUCA world, what it means. Nothing path breaking here, but just kind of setting some context here on what our definition of VUCA is and why it's so important to look at that. Obviously, then kind of pivot into VUCA-R and why Thomson Reuters is talking about VUCA-R and kind of, you know, the importance of that, because I feel like that's really the key element in VUCA today. Then we shift gears to corporates, and we've been speaking to a lot of corporates in the last several years of being in business, several decades of being in this business, but especially this region. We've kind of done a lot of discussions with Asia CFOs from Singapore and the region there, as well as in India, meeting with some of the largest you know, global MNC CFOs based out of India, and kind of gotten their views on what's going on within this whole regulation space, what's going on within this whole tax space, and kind of how our CFOs, who are the custodians of tax, among other things, you know, dealing with the whole change, which is kind of affecting them. And then finally, you know, our recommendation on how you get into the driver's seat and take control, right, as opposed to just being driven. So with that, obviously, as I'm assuming that everyone's done their Google research and gotten what VUCA is, but I'm going to open a trivia question with a poll. I hope we have the technology ready for the poll. So you have polling meters everywhere. It's an interesting question because I actually did this research myself, right? And so where did the term VUCA originate from? Harvard Business School, Premier Consulting Company. I didn't want to name any strategy author or military. All right, looks like the research has been done well. So it is number 4. It is the military. And what's very interesting is that it actually happened during the Cold War era, around the 90s, when the military started using the term VUCA for what was going to happen post-Cold War. And in 2002-ish is when strategy thinkers and business schools picked this up. In fact, when I was in business school in 2005, we had a whole kind of module on strategy in the VUCA world, and kind of, you know, there was a lot of discussion around kind of what's going to be the new norm. This was even before 2008, and obviously post 2008, we all know that we call it the new norm, BEPS, you name it. Every regulation has just stormed the market here, right? And with that, I want to just talk quickly about why VUCA is not a new phenomenon, right? If you look at the industrial revolution, the 4 industrial revolutions, now the 4th is a little bit of a question mark, but the 3 ones, the first 3 are very heavily documented. All of them, including the first one when we had kind of, you know, the introduction of mechanization, steam, the concept of factory coming in. The second one, which I feel is probably my favorite in terms of just the clear disruption, societal kind of way of living, is really around mass production electricity, but more importantly, the light bulb and the kind of change that brought to humanity per se, as well as kind of transportation when it comes to air, when it comes to cars. Henry Ford started his factory around that time frame. And then we obviously all are living in some ways the digital revolution between computers and internet. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this is not the first time that we've seen a massive shift in the world. I'm not talking about tax or any of the other factors here, but just pure change, which is affecting our lives, be it social media, be it kind of how we interact with people through kind of our phones, be it the amount of screen time we have, which iPhone tells us every week that it's increasing rapidly. And it's a phenomenon that's been going on since a really long time. And very interesting that Vijay talked about Google Trends. We had the same, I kind of just did a quick Google Trends, and what's funny is that while it's been going on since a long time, the last 2-3 years, it's just been exponential, right? This is the search on Google on the term VUCA, and you can see that chart just kind of skyrockets in the last 2 years or so, which just shows that there's, this term is gaining a lot of relevance, right? And now for the question of what is VUCA-R, right? So we have been kind of, if you think that VUCA overall is a term that's gaining a lot of popularity and a lot of kind of relevance because of what's happening in the world, to what Arun mentioned, VUCA-R, any guesses for what R means? Regulation, clearly, right? And it's been something which we've been talking to CFOs, we've been talking to a lot of folks over the last several years, and the last 1 to 2 years, I feel everyone is just talking, every CFO we meet is talking about how regulation is just changing their lives, right? How it's for the worse in some ways, right? Because it's very rapid. A lot of times it's actually retrospective, which obviously any finance guy hates. And it's just reshaping the world constantly, and the government is kind of constantly changing things for their objectives, which are, I think, very, very valid, but is causing a huge impact in terms of the way systems and companies are positioned today, right? So I think from that perspective, what I would say is, why Thomson Reuters? So I'm going to skip through a few slides because I want to be conscious of time. But why Thomson Reuters is talking about regulation per se. And again, I think this is one, I'll just step back here and just talk about what we do as a business. So we've been in this business of serving professionals in the legal industry, in the tax professionals, which are accounting firms primarily, corporations, and obviously we have Reuters News, which caters to kind of the mass news industry. But if you look at the first three, pretty much our entire business is focused around the intersection of regulation and commerce. And this is why we do feel that we have very deep insights, because we've been working on this, especially in that tax profession and corporation space, through tax propositions for multiple decades now. And we are a couple of $1 billion in revenue in just those two areas, which really shows that this is kind of something which we really invest in. And as we're seeing the momentum change in terms of regulation per se, we are just doubling down on this, right? So we've invested in trade propositions, because I think trade is probably the hottest topic of discussion, as mentioned yesterday, between the UK-EU deal, which is obviously has to be ratified and so on. But that's going to cause just complete chaos in the trade world, right? Obviously, US-China is not doing anything which is kind of helping the cause there. So in some ways, what we've done, and as you go through some of these things, especially towards the last end, where I talk about what you should be doing, or what this group should be doing according to us, to kind of be ahead of the curve. We kind of, I'm going to touch on that briefly, but Pierre in his presentation, Pierre is our head of market development for the region, and he's going to talk about this a lot more in detail around kind of how governments are changing, governments are digitizing, and what corporates should be doing. But I'll give you a sneak preview to that. So from that perspective, in terms of increased regulation, I've kind of touched upon a few of these between MENA, VAT, Pierre's from Dubai, and he's kind of been very, very crucial in terms of helping corporates as well as governments in the Middle East who have never had tax before try to understand, how to go about this, having this massive change from a Thomson Reuters perspective and leveraging our experience there. US tax reforms, I think we've all talked about that enough, and I think it's going to be, maybe while I'm speaking, maybe there's a Twitter feed which actually changes something else. And EU compliance, again, as I mentioned, UK, EU, there's just a whole lot of things happening there. But at the same time, the EU is at the forefront of like digitizing, having digital tax and having kind of digital ways to do compliance and tax. I'm going to throw some stats here. We did a research around 2017 on what the changes are in indirect taxes. I have three numbers here: 500, 5,000, and 17,000. So 500 is the number of changes we had in each of these regions between APAC, EMEA, as well as India, as per surveys in the first year of GST coming in, right? 500 changes in 1 year in each of these regions. And then you go to 5,000. By the way, that's North America. That's how many changes we had just in North America in 1 year in indirect taxes, be it rates, rules, logic, you name it, right? And that last one is 17,000. That's Latin America. So if anyone has ever had done business in Latin America, I've actually lived in Brazil for a couple of years. It is a complete chaos, right? There's like thousands of jurisdictions. They keep changing rates pretty much when they wake up in the morning and have their tea or coffee. It's pretty rapid. So again, just giving you a sense of why regulation is clearly extremely volatile and probably more so ever. And by the way, it's not going to stop, right? And it's going to continue to happen. It's going to continue to change. Arun referred to that a few times in his opening remarks. So why such rapid change regulation? This is again our take. Obviously there are another 50 reasons why, but we thought the top 3 has been increased globalization. The number 2x, that's literally kind of the number of multinational enterprises which have doubled in the last 8 to 10 years, right? So, and by the way, that feat took roughly 15 to 20 years before that. So this is kind of the cycles are shrinking and the multinational enterprises are increasing at a very, very rapid pace. Rise of global trade. So 70% is the share of global trade in the world GDP. 70% of the world's GDP goes through global trade. So basically it has some interaction between trade. That is an astounding number. This, by the way, obviously I don't know all of these. These are researches I've done over the last few days, but it was very shocking for me as well. And then the last one is relationship among countries, a lot more complex. 8x versus 2x. I'm kind of getting into the core of the reason why they're complex is the 8x number is basically the number of times exports grew in China over the last 10 years versus the US. And you can see the underlying reason why there is this pretty significant shift of what US is trying to do in terms of the trade sanctions in China. Right? This is kind of in my opinion, the underlying reason. And there's some beautiful videos on YouTube which show all these like statistics which keep moving from 1950s and 1900s to 2010. It's just fascinating, right? I spent a lot of time on those last few days. And the response to that is increased regulation. Clearly because the world is just opening up, everyone's trying to protect their turf. We were just talking yesterday in a small chat with Nishant actually on equalization levies and so on, and it's quite fascinating, right, in terms of what all countries are doing unilaterally to kind of change the game and protect their revenue share. And that gets me into what is the role of tax and regulation, right? And why are governments kind of just focusing on tax so much, be it tax on indirect tax, be it income tax, be it transfer pricing, be it customs and trade duties, right? That's primarily because 70 to 90% of the revenue comes from tax for governments. 70 to 90%, right? That's pretty much your entire revenue pool coming from taxes for governments. Imagine a corporation who has 90% of its the goods in one product. What would they do, right? they would try to make sure that they are at the forefront. They would try to make sure that they are really kind of doing whatever they can to increase that number, to protect that number and so on. And that's kind of what's happening in some ways. And when you look at kind of within that tax, consumption tax, GST, VAT, you name it, is almost 1/3 of that number, which is why you see an increasing focus, among other reasons, on indirect tax, GST, VAT, you name it, and all the compliances around that. And the underlying reason, and this is from a McKinsey study actually, which I'm quoting here, which basically they say that 20% of the government revenue is missing due to poor compliance, and that number by itself, if they obviously 20%, it's not like they're saying that you can capture the entire 20%, but just that number, to give you a sense of the magnitude of the number, that's equal to the GDP of Japan. So if they do even, and if I remember correctly, the government deficits typically range in the range of 1 to 2% for Western countries. I may be wrong here, but I'm talking from memory. Just by doing this, you could almost eliminate the entire deficit, right? Not even getting 20%. Even if you get 5% of the leakages, you could potentially eliminate some pretty significant deficits in government. So again, just going into the reason as to why this is becoming so important. And what are governments doing? They're embracing technology. That's kind of, we've seen that obviously in India, very, very close to home, with GST coming in. But you see that pretty much across the board, especially in countries like Europe, in regions like Europe, be it Poland, be it Spain, Australia, they are all kind of trying to get to the source, get to the transaction, because if they get to the transaction level detail is when they know that there's not going to be a leakage. They're going to be as close to perfect as they can, right? Which is why in Europe, in Poland, in Spain, they're asking pretty much to submit your entire transaction details. Now, one of the countries which actually did this in the first place was Brazil. They did this almost 20 years ago, but they obviously, 20 years ago, we didn't have the infrastructure and the technology and the data warehousing capabilities to do what we can do today. So they've gone through a whole evolution around how to get there. But clearly, again, I think that's the future. And everyone possibly over here who are all kind of experts in the tax domain have heard this, that the government eventually wants to eliminate corporations from filing tax. They want to just get the data. They want to just make sure that they capture all those line items. They want to just come back to the corporates and say, hey, listen, this is what your return is. Are you okay? Is there everything good? If yes, just say acknowledge and you're done, right? No returns, no compliance, because compliance is done. Now, this is not a fictional story. This is actually, I was reading on Estonia. They actually almost do that for income tax for sure. So income tax, if you're an individual in Estonia or a citizen from Estonia, you pretty much have to sit on the computer during tax filing season, go and put your digital ID. The government says, okay, this was your income, this is all the eligibility of exemptions you have. Just confirm. All your bank is linked to it. All your hospitals, expenses are linked to it. Whatever claims you have are linked to it. This is a research stat. An average Estonian citizen takes 5 minutes to file their returns. 5 minutes to file their income tax returns. Versus the US, which is obviously one of the most sophisticated in terms of technology and digitization and tons of providers out there, takes 13 hours for an average individual in the US to file their returns. And this is a stat, I'm not just making stuff up here. So again, it is getting to a reality, but are there not roadblocks? Yes, definitely, there are roadblocks, right? If you think about Estonia, which is the example I quoted, they started that journey somewhere in the 2000s. In 2007, they had a massive cyber attack, allegedly by their neighbor, not proven, but which kind of crashed the entire government system for a day. Complete crash, like complete blackout, right? They came out and it was expected that the government would be embarrassed, the government will kind of scale back on their digital initiative. They went full force ahead. And today, they have one of the most secure systems, from what I understand, in the world, and the way they kind of play out the whole digital story, it's kind of a role model, which has been studied by a lot of countries, right? So and obviously, coming back closer to home, India with GST, I think the first year, everyone has acknowledged, including the government, that it has been a tough first year, right? But when you do a change at this scale, there are going to be hiccups. We're not perfect. There's going to be technology is not is evolving as we speak, right? You talk about blockchain, you talk about AI. Again, Pierre is going to touch upon some of the blockchain discussions we have and give you an example on that. Very fascinating. But it's all work in process. And it's going to be. It's not going to be crystallized. It's going to be a constant work in process and a journey. So I have a quick poll question before I move into corporate. So with that backdrop, and all of you are generally from corporates in some shape or form or work with corporates, I'd like to put that question up. I mean, I'm hoping there's no surprises here. We will see. I'm still very enthused that 30% think corporates are digitizing faster. But listen, I think you get the drift, right? I mean, it is overwhelming that government government is just driving that change there, which is what I mean by we're all being driven. And that's kind of what this survey which we did across almost Asia as well as India, and this is actually kind of having discussions. It's not really your typical poll survey which kind of just goes out. But we actually did this in-person interviews with 30 of the largest Indian CFOs who are part of global companies. And the overwhelming response has been the transaction over the last several years, and this is actually a last decade or so is what we polled them on, has been just the transactional areas where ERPs are involved, internal financial data, they have pretty much automated it to the hilt, right? I mean, the kind of stuff, I remember the CNBC survey which we did with Nisha, and she used to always say that I feel like I'm talking to technologists, not CFOs, because they literally were talking about RPA, AI, automation, like analytics, and pretty much everything you can think of, which a finance person probably 10 years ago had no clue about. But when it comes to compliance, they acknowledge that it's just increasing constantly, but we just don't know what to do with it, right? Why is that? And Prateek, who we work with actually for HCL, he kind of mentioned this in a very nice kind of way in the study which we did, right? And he said, challenge in compliance is not about the constant churn in the VUCA world, but it's about implementing them at the right time, and especially if they're retrospective. How do we constantly kind of implement, because the government gives very little window for you to kind of start taking those changes into play. So I think the key thing in terms of why we've been driven is essentially it is difficult to automate technology when it's governed by local laws and regulations, right? Because you're not there, you have businesses in, even if you think about India, within all the states we have, it's not always easy, which is why we traditionally always resorted to one local person there kind of doing the job and kind of getting it done. And same thing is expounded multiple times over as you start getting into countries which are outside your core geography. And in the past when things were kind of more stable, you would actually kind of rely on the IT department to kind of get you there, right? Just incorporate some changes, put some patchworks in, get stuff moving through your ERPs and just get that through. But when you have changes, which I mentioned earlier, 500 changes, 5,000 changes in a year, imagine what your IT department's going to do, right? It's impossible for them to manage, and at the same time, them to actually know that there's a change, because the tax department would have to give them the change. They would have to put that in the queue. From my product development kind of experience, generally the queues are like 2 years long. So they'll say, yeah, 2 years later we'll fix it. By the way, the regulation's coming into effect next month, right? How do you deal with that? And finally, the overwhelming response we got from all of the CFOs, which is actually negative when I say overwhelming, is that they were just putting patchworks into place because they knew they had to put in some technology. It was one patchwork somewhere in Europe, another one for the US, another one for Russia, another one for Africa. It just all these varied systems, and they were just, this is not manageable, right? Which is why then they would resort back to going to Excel sheets and kind of how they were doing things in the past. So from that perspective, what do we bring to the table to say that we want to move to the driver's seat? How do we move to the driver's seat? And this is where our expertise comes into play. This is where what we do, this is what we do for a living at Thomson Reuters. And that's why I think we'll just share some perspectives of how we look at this, right? There's no right or wrong. There's 1,000 ways of getting to this. But in some ways, we have enough credibility working with Fortune 500 companies to kind of talk to you about this. And that's what I'm going to try and do. And in terms of why the need to be in control is primarily because of these 5 factors. So I'll just run through them. First one being visibility. You ask any of your CFOs or your peers, right? Do they feel comfortable about whether they've kind of, yes, they filed their compliance on time, yes. Is the compliance, what they filed, they feel comfortable about it? I would say, based on my experience, the majority of the responses have been shaky at best, right? And I'm not saying that that's possibly true. I'm sure some of you guys over here, as well as in the corporate world, have figured it out and are completely confident. The question is then, what kind of effort is going into that confidence? And there are different kind of corporations which I'll go through, where some may actually be very simple. No complexity, simple playing field, continue to do what you're doing, right? The next one is catching up with government. I've talked about this enough. I'm not going to go through this, but it's kind of something which I think from the poll as well was substantiated. Board and management. This is very interesting. Till a year before, I was the CFO for the region here in India and Southeast Asia. And this is actually something which started becoming a big topic of discussion. Tax was never a boardroom topic. The last few years, especially even in India with the Companies Act coming in, that has changed dramatically, right? Because there's now criminal liabilities, there's now personal liabilities, no one wants to take a call, everyone wants to understand what's going on. The general norm across the globe is that there is zero tolerance for non-compliance. Doesn't matter if it's a $5,000 issue, doesn't matter if it's a $500 issue, you just cannot have non-compliance. And there's dashboards and so on which have to go to the board. So clearly this is becoming a big reason why for the transformation. And one of the things which is not talked about much is talent. As we are talking to, and I think Karan will kind of can touch on this a little bit as well with Kinney, would be about how that talent pool which we have today is not what it used to be 10 years ago. Typically, I feel like, in my early days of taxation, everyone I met with from the corporate world were always there for 20 years, 15 years, had the entire kind of, landscape of their tax journey over the last a decade or a few decades. In today's world, the millennial generation, which we talk about, right, is not going to be there for 10 years. By the way, even if they're there, they will be there only if you kind of help them understand why should I do this in Excel, why should I file the same thing 10 times, because they don't want to do that, right? They don't want to do transactional stuff. So if you want talent, which I think is not something which we generally talk about much in finance, because it's something which is kind of I feel like some of the CFOs I've spoken to are pioneers about kind of how they manage talent, but it is a big reason for change, right? Not only that, because you want continuity, because you don't want to have people reliance if someone leaves and you have like the entire systems go with them, but also because you want to retain talent. You want to have them do more strategic stuff. You want to have them be business partners to tax. As tax guys, be business partners. And that's what I hear a lot of the tax heads I speak to doing today. They're talking about transactions. They're talking about how they're supporting M&A deals, how they are the make or break on transactions, right? But the most important, and we're all kind of part of this finance function eventually, is that 30% of your cash outflow is in taxes. This is a mind-boggling number, right? And I don't think this has been talked about enough in terms of how much, be it, yes, I mean, you know, you have input tax, output tax, credit set-offs, and so on. But in terms of cash outflow, if you think about indirect tax, GST, IDT, and so on, there's roughly anywhere from, in our research, roughly anywhere from 15% to 28% is the tax rates, or 30% of the tax rates, and if you compound them all together, right? That's just GST, and that's on the top line, not on your profits, on the top line. And then you add to that corporate tax, you roughly add 30% of your cash outflow statement in the cash flow statement, inflow, outflow, 30% is taxes. And from my days in Thomson Reuters, when I was in corporate in the US, I have spent a year developing reports on travel and entertainment expense, which is 0.5% of your entire top line. Everyone's obsessed with who's traveling, who's a top 10 spender in travel, who's taking these flights, who's traveling business class. But there's like a whole institution behind that. And then you think about taxes, there's not much which we've done in the past as finance guys, right? So the question then is, how do you automate the traditionally unautomatable? Yes, it's a tongue twister, Karan, you're right. And this is where, you know, I'll just give you a quick example and then actually kind of hand it over to Karan for a quick chat with Kinney. But essentially, this is an example which we just took from some of the discussions we had, which is what I was saying. If you look at the initial stage, sorry for the rudimentary slide here, but if you talk about the initial stage, you have like say 2 states, you pick a map of India, you have 2 states scattered around there, and you have a single ERP, you have just a few products, less than 100 items procured, you have 1 or 2 tax FTEs, employees, you're sorted, right? You don't need much. And maybe you don't. Maybe you're okay. Because the complexity is minimal, you could handle it in your core transaction system, and that's fine. The issue comes in when you start growing, right? You grow into 15 states. You now acquire a few small local regional players who have different ERP systems, right? Now your products have increased, your items which you procure have increased. Now your tax kind of infrastructure is 4 tax FTEs, 2 advisors, you have a litigation advisor, and so on. Then you start going global, because you now have you're growing at a breakneck speed. You really have figured out the secret sauce in your business. Now you want to go global, right? And you go 15 countries, 6 ERPs, 15 tax FTEs. Now your tax team is becoming big, and your litigation is becoming big, right? Now that's great because you want to spend time on litigation because there's enough ambiguities today. But the question that always comes across is, what do you want to do about kind of getting the transaction stuff in place? And by the way, add to that the constant regulatory changes which we talked about. So how do you deal with that? And this is where I'll kind of just pass on the mantle to Karan. Karan heads India for Thomson Reuters, and Vishwanath, dear friend, Global Head of Taxation Tech Mahindra, to kind of talk about the experiences.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Vishal. So just taking the cue from Vishal on that, and quick question.
Karan, you'll have to speak up.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Is it better?
I don't know. There's something wrong with
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. So, for Vish, very fondly, as you referred to, you don't need an introduction, and Tech Mahindra doesn't need an introduction. But what was your need to look at, tax transformation, and why technology around that?
Yeah, thanks, Karan. I think Tech Mahindra initially, and probably some 8 or 10 years back, we were quite small. Take the year of 2004, 2005. We were present almost in only 4 or 5 countries. And the Indian regulation was, not that complex, and more to do with the direct tax. But over the years, what has happened is we have grown in many countries. I think the number of entities today, what we have is almost like a presence in 90 countries, 225 entities. and I think it's multiplying. The M&As and the acquisitions keep on happening. And you know what used to happen was over-dependence on an individual, and the number of regulatory changes which used to happen globally and India. I mean, it was just not possible for an organization to keep pace with that speed. And I think that was one of the main reasons why we had to automate, especially the indirect tax and the direct tax.
So I think that's a great perspective around that. And just for a lot of people to appreciate in terms of what was your, or what was Tech Mahindra's evaluation criteria? You know, what did you think about how do you tackle this growth, which is great, but what was the evaluation that you went through?
Yeah, I think what has gone into our mind is, as Vishal also touched upon that point. I mean, the compliance globally, the board and the management requirement, the board or the CFO or the CEO signing on the dotted line on certain compliance, and the regulatory change environment in India. So there was a huge onus and the responsibility over the top management. And when you are getting into such a regulatory mechanism, I mean, sometimes the cost slightly becomes secondary because compliance takes the priority over cost. Obviously, when you do this automation, you have in the back of your mind the cost has to be really optimal. But from a global perspective, I would think compliance has taken a front seat over the cost. Yeah.
And I think just from Vishal's last question also in terms of talent, I know you've got a great team that is based out of with Pune. You've got folks that are sitting in the regions. So how do you look at managing your tax talent? What's the strategy around that?
Yeah, I think nowadays retaining talent is really a challenge, and what we have is young chartered accountants doing all this compliance across the globe. Now their interest in the work is anything interesting, anything analytical. But when they are asked to do a compliance of just filing a return through an Excel, etc., that's something what really bothers them. And retention has become a big issue, and that's I think the attrition has gone up, especially in these areas, especially because there's too much of over dependence on transaction work. So they want to get this thing automated, and they want to spend time on really analytical things, and that's where I think most of the organizers would be looking to retain talent. Unless until you automate, I don't think it's very difficult to retain talent.
Fantastic. I think that was just a quick perspective in terms of what Tech Mahindra thought about. I think you started that journey in 2016. It's a great transformation. There were CFOs that have changed, Milind, and now you've got Manoj, big backers in terms of making sure that you continue on that technology journey. So I think that puts it into perspective. Over to you, Vishal.
Just want to touch on like a few conversations we had even last evening was like, again, just gives me a sense of, I think Vish touched on a few aspects on how, some of these discussions are actually kind of influencing the way whether the deal goes through or not, right, in general overall. And just I think that's becoming a big discussion point across the board, which is actually what's driving CFOs to really start, as one of the CFOs who are not named kind of mentioned was that in the past I used to have the tax team sit at the corner and they just did that thing, like it's like a magic, which kind of just let them do their thing. I'm just going to get out of their way. Now I've kind of shifted their space to right where I walk in every day, right? Because everything I do every day has massive tax implications, which land up kind of having me kind of talk to the board about why this is working and why this is not, why a deal is going through and why it's not. What is the roadblock between kind of a deal which we need to do, which is becoming a tax issue, which is why the entire thing is kind of just stalled. And I keep hearing these examples multiple times, including a few conversations we had last evening. So from that perspective, what I want to just touch on briefly is the rise of expert systems. And what do I mean by that, right? In some ways, in the past, we've all been used to software, which is kind of just a software, right? It's kind of, works. It's a box. Think about all of us use Excel, right? Again, any spreadsheet which we use, it's kind of you feed in the information, you maintain it, you kind of continue to kind of update it and so on till at some point it crashes, right? Because it does as it gets big. But in some ways, barring that experience which we've possibly all gone through, but overall, you are maintaining all that content. The new world which we live in, be it not just in tax, right, be it treasury, be it so many of these functions which are very specialist functions, it's not just about the software. What generally, again, companies like ours do, which are playing in the tax technology space, is we have roughly, across the globe, almost 20% of our workforce are qualified professionals, be it chartered accountants, lawyers, guys who have done masters in accounting. This is whom we employ, and why we employ them is because they are the ones who are maintaining the content, maintaining the 17,000 changes that are happening in LATAM, the 5,000 that are happening in North America on almost a real-time basis. In trade, which we just acquired a company called Integration Point last year, it's just fascinating. I mean, we are able to kind of incorporate changes in a span of 16 to 24 hours in some cases, even though they're not even digital. So there are ways and means we've kind of come up with a workflow to kind of just constantly update that. And what happens then, right? What happens then is because we're serving thousands of large corporations across the globe, we have the ability to use that and leverage that scale which we built. So you don't have to kind of manage this constantly. You don't have to worry about what's happening in Brazil today, because something definitely happened. If you think about 17,000 divided by 365, you can do the math, right? I mean, there's a lot of changes that happen every day. How are you going to keep on top of that? So this is kind of what, this is, by the way, this is tax technology. You replace it with other treasury technology and so on. It's the same framework which a lot of these leading companies, including like, guys like Tech Mahindra are following, is essentially that you have your core system of records, right? And you keep them clean. I remember in Thomson Reuters when, in the initial years of my career with Thomson, I've been with them for 12 years, most of them in finance. We had one of the largest ERPs. I'm sure everyone, one of the largest and most popular ERPs is what we operated on as well, right? And we had changed it so much that even the guys from the company were not able to recognize what had happened to the CRP. And that's not unique, by the way. That's not just us. Most of us have done that. Most corporations have gone through a life cycle around that, right? And essentially, the new mantra is that keep your ERP, keep your core system of records clean, right? That's just for your transaction. That's just for your recording of that's kind of the bookkeeping, the double entry system. That's just for that. And then you use connectors, which is, I think, the biggest revolution when it comes to technology in this space is the APIs, the kind of connectors that connect your ERP to your technology platforms and then seamlessly flow through, right? So you have seamless kind of interaction between your tax technology in this case, which kind of houses your tax data, your rules, your logic, because you could have company A could take a position on something else, company B could take a position on something else. A company acquired took a position which is something different than what you've taken. How do you factor all of that in? Typically, they try to put that in the code, right? And the IT guys go nuts. Nowadays, one of the functions they hate the most is the tax function, because they constantly keep coming up with new requests of changes. Not because they want to, but because the government's doing that, right? So how do you kind of keep up to that? How do you kind of make sure that you are constantly up at the forefront of kind of compliance, which absolutely we have to, right? And at the same time, don't drive yourselves crazy, which is kind of what this framework does, because it connects not only to your core systems, but also connects generally with, be it your procurement systems, be it your travel systems, you name it, and there's connectors nowadays for everything, right? So you're getting real-time data, which is managed by thousands of professionals centrally, but you are able to scale that at a fraction of the cost because you don't have to worry about having those people do that. So I think that's kind of, in some ways, the framework. And kind of just to sum it up here, I know I'm seeing the clock here ticking down very quickly. To sum it up here, what I'd say is that between what's happening in the world, around kind of the VUCA-R world, which we defined, the tax changes which we are coming through, and kind of how corporations have to be at the forefront, because eventually there's going to be a time where you have to report every transaction. That's coming soon, to India. The first phase is going to be next year. It's already there in a lot of countries, including in Europe and Latin America. You've got to report all your transactions, right? There's no time for reconciliation anymore. It's there, it's out there, it's live. You've got to get it live, right, real time, every time. And that's what technology enables you to. So obviously, we've talked about, Karan asked that question as well, how do you evaluate the technology? And we've come across this question from pretty much every CFO we talk to. You come and say all of this, but we just don't understand, because there are now thousands of different kind of local, global players out there. How do you do that, right? And this is where I'll leave you with a framework which we've kind of developed to provide you with visibility and control, is the secure framework. This is something which we've kind of gone through a lot of pain to kind of walk through all the different aspects which you want to look at as you think about leveraging tax technology. And sometimes when you look at all of this, you'll say, you know what, I don't need it. Now is not the time. And that's totally okay, but do that evaluation, right? We obviously have these, this is a lot of text on one slide. So we have a few copies out there for you to kind of listen to what the finance leaders are saying, as well as kind of explore this framework a little bit. Happy to talk about it more during breaks, but this is what I want to leave you with. Hopefully this kind of made sense, gave you some perspective around the theme, but at the same time kind of how to tackle that. And with that, I'll kind of pass it on to you.